Dominic Cummings was running the government during the pandemic and was acting as Prime Minister in all but name. That is according to Sajid Javid, who was Chancellor at the very start of 2020. He's been giving evidence to the inquiry today, where he revealed that Boris Johnson was simply not in charge and that his most senior aide held most of the power.
It was clear that in Mr. Cummings, the Prime Minister had picked someone that he had decided to, for whatever reason, to trust with a huge amount of responsibility and power. And many times I felt like that many of the key decisions were being made by Mr. Cummings and not the Prime Minister, in a way that I had not seen with any other Prime Minister, certainly that I had worked with.
But just hours later, it was the former Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab's turn to give evidence, and he appeared to contradict everything Mr. Javid said about Cummings.
I think he correctly identified some of the structural challenges without getting into the he said, she said, frankly, soap opera of Westminster bubble politics. The broader question you raised about whether Boris Johnson was a puppet, I'm afraid I don't find that a serious allegation. I think Boris Johnson certainly relied on his key advisors. By the way, I think you have to, if you're going to get through the work, particularly in a pandemic.
Joining me in the studio now, TalkTV international editor Isabel Oakeshott. Good to have you here, Isabel. We're also joined by Ruby Lott-Lavigna, a reporter at Open Democracy. And at the moment, we're saying Ruby's greatest claim to fame is she's the only reporter to have endured every single second and moment of the COVID inquiry. I know, good luck to her. So let's start with Ruby, because she's always there and she doesn't miss a moment. Ruby, just keep us abreast of the latest developments. We've got complete contradiction here.
Yeah, absolutely. So today has really been, everywhere at once. We've had Jenny Harris, who was a former Deputy Chief Medical Officer, giving her evidence as a scientist. Then we went on to Sajid Javid, who was Chancellor before COVID. And then we've had Dominic Raab, who was Deputy PM at the time of the pandemic. And, it centered around loads of issues. When did we lock down? Should we have discharged patients with COVID back into care homes? And also, of course, it wouldn't be the COVID inquiry if we were not discussing Dominic Cummings and whether he was controlling what was happening or what wasn't. And as you mentioned before in your clips, there was this real conversation or disagreement about whether he was in complete control. Sajid Javid said he sought to act as Prime Minister in all but name. But this is not new from Sajid Javid. We know that he does not like Dominic Cummings, and he has made it very clear, it was mainly the reason he resigned as Chancellor back in 2020. So there's no surprises there. And as I don't agree with him much, but as Dominic Raab says, this is all part of this sort of Westminster psychodrama. And, sometimes maybe we should be focusing on, bereaved families or other things other than maybe whether Dominic Cummings was running the country.
Well, absolutely. Isabel, this would all be fine if it were fiction and this were House of Cards and we were having a discussion about who was pulling the strings and who was the puppet and everything else. But this is a situation whereby we have so many bereaved families, so many people's lives, attenuated so many mental health problems, a legacy for our children and everything else. This is really serious stuff, which when you look at those clips and when you think about the sort of take-out message from today, it makes it sound very trivial and very silly,
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is an absurdity. From the point of view of the nation, what is the point of raking over the minutiae of personalities who are never going to be back in government?
Quite.
OK, so why is the inquiry, which is dragging on for a very, very long time period, it has no deadline, the judge is doing her best to produce something in some kind of time frame, but we don't know when we'll ever get the full conclusions of this. Why are they wasting time raking over the he said, she said, who did what in the minutiae of personalities like Dominic Cummings at this point, when what we really need to nail is the key decisions and were they taken at the right time, and overall was the thrust of the response to the pandemic the right one? These are the most major, the most important questions which will apply next time in a pandemic. Dominic Cummings is not going to be there next time in the pandemic. Boris Johnson is not going to be there next time in the pandemic. If there is another pandemic, we'll have a whole different administration. So in a sense, it's neither here nor there whether Cummings was pulling the strings or Boris Johnson was pulling the strings. We need to look at the validity of the decisions that were taken.
Do you think that the justice presiding over proceedings really ought to be saying, this is not what we're seeking to establish? I don't want to know your private feelings about whether Boris Johnson was in charge, wasn't in charge, was a puppet, was a vacillator, was actually not a vacillator.
Yeah.
And we've heard so many different assessments of Boris Johnson's personality, characteristics, predilections, capacity to be a leader, you know,
and
strong
we can go
suits,
on and on,
weak suits,
and
whatever it is. And you're quite right, he's never going to be in that position again. It's
Right.
never going to happen again. So should the person in charge, it's Lady Justice
Baroness Harris.
Baroness, exactly.
Yeah, very experienced
Should
judge.
she be saying, now look, you know, this is not something that comes free of charge. It's incredibly expensive.
I wish she would
We're
say
paying
that.
for it.
Yeah.
This isn't what we're trying to establish. The questions I want answered are these pertinent questions. Answer them and get off the witness box so we can get on with the next one and
Well,
get
I mean,
to the
she should be
crucial
saying
stuff.
that to the barristers, you know, the Inquiry Council, who are wasting a great deal of time and taxpayers' money on irrelevant material. We don't have time for this because another pandemic could happen at any point. You know, barely a day passes when there isn't some kind of report of some kind of virus or highly infectious thing somewhere. Of course, we're all now on much higher alert for this stuff than we would have been before. We don't know when the next pandemic is coming. My massive disappointment with this inquiry is that it doesn't have a strict time frame, that its remit is absurd. It covers everything. It takes you a long while just to read the remit because it is so broad. Other countries have got through and out this process. They've kept it tight. They've stuck in a very focused manner to the key questions that are going to be of utility next time we're in this situation.
Exactly.
God hope we're not.
Ruby, you're witnessing all of this. Do you feel as if it's rambling? Do you feel as if there's some kind of shambolic, leisurely quality to it, that it's so broad-ranging, there's no real focus, and therefore, if there are any, I hate the phrase, but if there are any lessons to be learned, they're lost in the midst of the general kind of flow of free-flowing information. It's kind of stream of consciousness almost.
I think not quite. You know, obviously, this is an issue that a lot of people have raised. But when you are only focusing on 10 seconds, 20 seconds of the inquiry, you are obviously missing the 6 other hours of the day where lots of other issues have been discussed. And I understand that people are concerned that we are focusing too closely on kind of political drama at this point. But of course, we are in the second module, which is literally discussing what political governance and decision making. You know, we had preparedness, that was the first module, and we will go on to discuss vaccines and care homes. So it is understandable that this module is examining that. And I think, you know, it is important for the bereaved families to also have a chance to feel like politicians are being questioned about the decisions they were making fully, you know, in front of the inquiry. And I think from my reporting with those families, that's very important to them. But I understand it's a really long process. I know it so well. But I do think, you know, we shouldn't just assume that the inquiry is not getting at anything important just because it's picking up on some Westminster drama. That is largely due down to, you know, you and I and the media covering it quite a lot, because it does cover a lot of other stuff throughout the day.
All right, well, let me ask the question the other way around then, Ruby. You've been there for the entire thing so far. What do you think has been important that has been addressed? Has anything been established that you didn't know? Have there been any areas that you think will lead to some kind of constructive development for next time, or something being put in place so that the same errors aren't repeated?
Absolutely. I think the fact that there was very little planning documentation when it came to pandemics and how, or at least a COVID pandemic, that was like basically not covered at all. There was very little discussion over whether there were, you know, how to prepare for issues around structural inequalities. So I think going forward, that'll be something people focus on a lot more. You know, a minister for preparedness is something that has come up a lot. The Cabinet Office being terribly organised and structured has come up a lot. So I think, you know, those are the things that will be focused on.
Ruby, for a second.
I sit here in despair. I mean, to think that we are spending £100 million on the top lines that you've just come up with. You know, if the best takeaway is that we need a minister for preparedness and that there weren't any pandemic plans, we knew that before this inquiry started. It's amply demonstrated. What I think we have learned, and we've learned a few little things. We've learned just how last minute the decision was to lock down. You and I will have different views on that, but plan A was not to lock down. And Matt Hancock, who will give evidence tomorrow, will probably make a very strong case as to why there was a sudden volte-face in the middle of March. But we came tantalisingly close to not locking down at all. And we can argue about the merits of that or not merits, but that period, I think, is critical to learn about.
I think we should all remember the moment when the many moments, the years when it seemed as if it was utterly impossible, not to mention improbable, that British people would dream of locking down.
And they didn't think it would work.
We didn't think that we could do that stuff.
They didn't think it would work.
No, they didn't think it would work.
They
absolutely.
changed in mid-March because they were rattled by very frightening projections of mortality rates. And frankly, in a way, who can blame them? If you're a politician, you've got that on your head. So very, very difficult.
Yeah, very difficult. Ruby, so tomorrow, Matt Hancock in prospect.
Yeah, and it's not the first time he's come up against the inquiry. You know, it was certainly quite a controversial day last time, and I imagine, you know, he's speaking for a day and a half. Some things have come up around Matt Hancock beforehand in this inquiry, that he does not tell the truth, and he does not base his comments on facts. Other people have defended Hancock. I think a lot of people will be interested in what he has to say, but also will take a lot of it with a pinch of salt, because he has spent a lot of time trying to
someone who spent a lot of time with Matt Hancock and knows every word of these emails by heart, pretty much. You know, Matt Hancock taking the stand. Anything that we don't already know from your book and his book and everything else?
What I would like to hear is the judge and the barristers challenging Matt Hancock on why he removed the WhatsApp messages that were shared with me, lots and lots of them. He removed everything relating to March 2020. So what was it in those messages that he did not want to share, not just with me, but with all the readers he hoped would read his diary of the pandemic? So can we nail what it is that was so sensitive about that period, because he revealed an awful lot else, that he wanted to take it out of the communications? Beyond that, I'm not expecting much new from him. He is not going to show any contrition. He will double down, I'm sure of it. And by the way, he's been preparing for this from pretty much day one of the pandemic. They all knew this day would come. Very, very conscious of it.
OK, let me ask you, Isabel, while you're here, when Michael Gove apologised, what did you think?
Well, I don't want to hear any apologies from Michael Gove personally. As somebody who thinks that repeated lockdowns were an absolute catastrophe, Michael Gove's role during the pandemic was very behind the scenes. He was one of the most powerful figures, probably one of the four most powerful figures, who was repeatedly ratcheting things up behind the scenes, more and ever harder removal of civil liberties. So for him to be apologising for the impact of all of that, I think is pretty rich. He had plenty of power at the time to do things differently.